The very first time Margaret Pendelton unlocked the storage space her husband had covertly leased for 20 years, she assumed she had made a massive error. Absolutely nothing inside appeared to belong to the predictable man she had cherished for 42 years. Yet within moments, she would unearth hidden files, secret ledgers, and financial records, proving the husband she grieved had been leading a double life she couldn't have possibly fathomed. At 68, Margaret firmly believed the most difficult chapter of her life was already closed. 6 months prior, she had buried her husband, Arthur, after he passed away quietly in his sleep. Arthur had been the very definition of a creature of habit. For decades, he was a man measured by the ticking of a mahogany grandfather clock. He wore a charcoal suit every Tuesday, drank his black coffee at exactly 7 in the morning, and worked as a senior actuary calculating risk. Their life together was a well-rehearsed theatrical play, completely devoid of surprises. Margaret found profound solace in this rigid structure. Arthur Pendelton was a man measured by the ticking of a mahogany grandfather clock. He wore a charcoal suit every Tuesday. He drank his black coffee at exactly 7 in the morning. His life stood as a monument to absolute transparency. He was a senior actuary at a downtown firm. His daily work involved calculating risk and quantifying the unpredictable. He applied this exact mathematical rigor to his personal life. Spontaneity was an alien concept in the Pendelton household. Vacations were scheduled 18 months in advance. Grocery lists were categorized by supermarket aisles. Yet, for 20 consecutive years, this paragon of predictability secretly paid for a locked room on the industrial edge of town. Margaret shared 42 years of marriage with him. She knew the exact angle he preferred his morning newspaper folded. She understood the precise cadence of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. Their existence together was comfortable and entirely devoid of surprises. It resembled a well-rehearsed theatrical play. There were no missed cues. There were no improvised lines. Margaret found profound solace in this rigid structure. It provided a secure fortress against a chaotic outside world. Arthur was an open book with large, legible print. He kept his receipts in chronological order. He filed his tax returns 3 months early. Then, the fortress crumbled without warning. Arthur passed away quietly in his sleep on a rainy Thursday. His sudden departure was the only unscripted event of his entire existence. The aftermath left Margaret adrift in a painfully quiet house. The grandfather clock continued to mark the time. The coffee maker sat cold and unused. Grief did not arrive as a violent storm. It settled as a heavy, suffocating dust over the familiar furniture. Margaret spent her days preserving the museum of their shared history. She kept his leather slippers aligned by the reading armchair. She dusted his pristine collection of vintage fountain pens. The daily routine remained intact, but the underlying purpose had vanished. She moved through the empty rooms like a ghost, haunting her own memories. The world outside continued its relentless spin. Margaret remained firmly anchored to the past. 6 months passed in this state of suspended animation. A crisp October morning brought the mail carrier to her front porch. Margaret retrieved the small stack of envelopes from the brass mailbox. Most were standard utility bills and generic gardening catalogs. One specific item immediately stood out. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address bore a stark, modern corporate logo: Harbor Storage Solutions. Margaret frowned at the unfamiliar name. The Pendeltons never accumulated excess belongings. Arthur actively despised physical clutter. Every single item in their home possessed a designated, practical purpose. Renting a storage unit directly contradicted his core philosophy of minimalism. She assumed it was a simple clerical error. It had to be a piece of misdirected junk mail. She sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. The paper inside was heavy and formal. It was a final notice of overdue payment. The outstanding balance was attached to Unit C-17. Margaret scanned the printed text. The black ink seemed to blur against the white page. She forced her eyes to focus on the specific details. The lease agreement bore Arthur's full legal name. It featured his unmistakable, precise signature at the bottom. The start date of the contract chilled her to the bone. October 4th, 2003, exactly 20 years ago. The grandfather clock chimed in the hallway. The metallic sound suddenly felt mocking. Margaret sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The piece of paper trembled in her hands. This was not a bureaucratic mistake. The billing details matched a forgotten dividend account perfectly. A small automated deduction had occurred every single month for 2 decades. It was buried deep within complex financial statements she rarely reviewed. Arthur had hidden it in plain sight. The man who documented every penny spent on gasoline had maintained a shadow ledger. Her mind raced through 20 years of memories. She actively searched for cracks in his flawless facade. She looked for unexplained absences. She tried to recall sudden changes in mood or secretive phone calls. There were absolutely none. Arthur had been physically and emotionally present every single day. He never worked late without calling the house line. He never took solitary weekend trips. His perfect alibi was his unwavering, monotonous routine. This made the existence of Unit C-17 entirely impossible. Yet, the official document lay flat on the oak table. It was a tangible piece of evidence, destroying 42 years of absolute certainty. Margaret looked around her pristine kitchen. The gleaming granite countertops offered no answers. The perfectly aligned spice jars now seemed like a deliberate lie. If Arthur could successfully conceal a physical space for 20 years, his entire identity was suspect. The paralyzing grief slowly morphed into something sharp and dangerous. It became a cold, piercing curiosity. The official notice demanded immediate payment to prevent the public auction of the unit's contents. She had exactly 48 hours to respond. The predictable widow was suddenly faced with a highly unpredictable choice. She could throw the letter into the fireplace and preserve the immaculate memory of her husband. Or she could drive across the city and unlock a door that was never meant to be opened. Margaret reached for her car keys. The illusion of predictability was permanently shattered. The industrial zone on the eastern edge of the city offered no comfort. Concrete warehouses loomed like gray monoliths against the pale morning sky. Margaret parked her sedan in front of Harbor Storage Solutions. The facility was a sprawling maze of corrugated metal and razor wire. It felt entirely alien to her quiet suburban existence. She and Arthur had shared a life of manicured lawns and predictable Sunday crosswords. This place belonged to transient lives and forgotten cargo. She clutched the brass key. The metal was cold against her palm. A heavy iron gate slid open with a mechanical groan. Margaret stepped into the labyrinth. Row after row of identical orange doors stretched into the distance. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. Rainwater pooled in the uneven pavement. Her footsteps echoed off the metal walls. Sector A passed by in a blur of rusted padlocks. Sector B offered nothing but the hum of distant highway traffic. Finally, she reached Sector C. The numbers on the doors were painted in stark black stencils: 15, 16, 17. Margaret stopped. Unit C-17. There was nothing remarkable about the exterior. It was a standard roll-up door. A streak of rust stained the bottom edge. A heavy-duty padlock secured the latch. Arthur had never mentioned renting a storage space. They had an empty attic and a spacious garage. There was no logical reason for this hidden expense. She inserted the key. The tumblers clicked with surprising smoothness. The lock had been oiled recently. Margaret pulled the metal handle upward. The corrugated door rattled loudly. It coiled into the ceiling housing with a final, heavy clank. Dust did not billow out. There was no smell of mildew or decaying cardboard. The transition was violently abrupt. Instead, a wave of warm, dry air met her face. It carried the distinct scent of polished wood, expensive leather, and brewed espresso. Margaret reached for a wall switch just inside the frame. Soft, amber light flooded the space. She froze on the threshold. Her breath caught in her throat. The interior defied every law of the bleak industrial park outside. The cold concrete floor was covered by a thick, crimson Persian rug. The corrugated metal walls were completely hidden behind custom-fitted oak panels. The walls were perfectly plumb. They masked the steel shell completely. Soundproofing foam lined the ceiling. It deadened the harsh noises of the facility outside. This was not a storage unit. It was a meticulously designed private study. In the center of the room stood a massive mahogany desk. Its surface was polished to a mirror finish. A high-backed leather executive chair sat pushed back. It looked as if the occupant had just stepped away for a moment. A vintage banker's lamp with a green glass shade rested on the corner of the desk. Margaret stepped inside. The heavy metal door remained open behind her. It framed the gray reality of the outside world like a grim painting. Inside, she was standing in a parallel universe. Along the left wall, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held hundreds of volumes. They were neatly organized by subject and color. A small climate control unit hummed quietly in the corner. A brass humidifier emitted a faint, rhythmic vapor. They maintained a perfect, museum-like atmosphere. On the right wall, a sleek coffee station featured a high-end espresso machine and a row of ceramic cups. Arthur was a retired high school history teacher. His pension was modest. Their life together had been comfortable but strictly frugal. The furniture in this room alone cost more than their family car. She walked closer to the desk. Every object had a specific place. A set of expensive fountain pens lay aligned perfectly next to a leather blotter. A brass clock ticked softly. It counted the seconds in this hidden sanctuary. There were no cobwebs. The surfaces were entirely free of dust. Someone had maintained this space with obsessive care. Arthur had spent his supposed weekly fishing trips right here. He had traded the open lake for a windowless steel box. Margaret ran her fingers over the back of the leather chair. The material was buttery soft. She looked around the enclosed room. There were no windows. The only connection to the outside was the roll-up door she had just opened. Yet, the space did not feel claustrophobic. The warm lighting and rich textures created an atmosphere of absolute focus and security. She noticed the electrical wiring. It was expertly hidden behind the baseboards. A heavy-duty silent battery bank sat disguised as a wooden cabinet near the back wall. Arthur had engineered an entirely self-sufficient grid. He had brought light and warmth into a dead steel shell. A framed map of the city hung on the wall behind the desk. It was marked with dozens of colored pins. Red, blue, and yellow dots clustered in specific neighborhoods. Why would a quiet, predictable man build a secret fortress of solitude? This was not a place for a casual hobby. This was a command center. The sheer effort required to smuggle oak paneling and heavy furniture into a rental unit without drawing attention was staggering. The craftsmanship was professional. He must have spent thousands of hours building it himself in absolute secrecy. He had built a ship inside a bottle. He had done it right under the noses of the facility managers. Margaret noticed a small, framed photograph on the edge of the desk. It was a picture of her. It was taken 30 years ago during a trip to the coast. She was smiling, unaware of the camera. He had kept her image here. She was the only piece of his outside life permitted in the heart of his secret world. The paradox was absolute. Outside lay a desolate landscape of rust, asphalt, and forgotten things. Inside existed a sanctuary of order, wealth, and intense purpose. The man she had buried last week was a stranger. The Arthur she knew existed only in the suburbs. The man who occupied this chair was an architect of secrets. She sat down in the leather seat. It enveloped her. The desk stretched out in front of her like a vast continent waiting to be explored. The silence of the room pressed against her ears. The heavy metal door outside seemed to wait for a command. Margaret reached out and touched the green glass of the banker's lamp. The glass was cold. The switch clicked. The bulb flared to life. It cast a sharp circle of light onto the pristine leather blotter. The stage was set. The actor was gone. Only the props remained. They waited in the silence, ready to reveal the plot of a play she never knew was being performed. The air inside Unit C-17 smelled of cedar and aged paper. Margaret stepped past the threshold. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind her, sealing away the hum of the storage facility. She stood in the center of an impossible room. A massive corkboard dominated the space above a polished mahogany desk. It was a sprawling mosaic of human relief. Dozens of handwritten notes, printed emails, and glossy photographs were pinned in meticulous rows. Margaret stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the addresses and salutations. None of the envelopes bore her husband's real name. Every single letter of gratitude was addressed to a man named Tom. Arthur had built a clandestine empire of salvation in the shadows. He did not hide a betrayal. He engineered miracles. Margaret reached out. Her fingertips brushed against a piece of pale blue stationery. The ink was slightly smudged, likely from a tear. It was a thank you note from a single mother in Ohio. The text detailed a rent payment that arrived mere hours before a scheduled eviction. Next to it hung a Polaroid of a young man standing beside a food truck. The caption below it read, "To Tom, for believing in the dream." Arthur was the invisible force keeping these lives from collapsing. He received no public recognition. He attended no charity galas. His reward was this private gallery of survival. The corkboard was not a trophy case. It was a map of restored stability. Arthur left no room for ambiguity in his methods. The desk drawers held the rigorous anatomy of his secret operation. Margaret pulled open the top right compartment. Heavy manila folders sat suspended in green hanging files. They were arranged geographically by state, then alphabetically by city. She lifted the first folder from the front. A printed spreadsheet was stapled to the inside cover. It tracked a precise, unyielding sequence of events. First came the identification of a crisis. Arthur collected local newspaper clippings about devastating house fires. He printed out crowdfunding campaigns that had stalled far short of their goals. He sought out the people who had slipped through the cracks of systemic support. Next came the verification phase. Arthur did not throw money blindly at digital tragedies. He executed surgical financial strikes. The folders contained public property records, court dockets, and redacted hospital debt summaries. He cross-referenced addresses and verified the legitimacy of the debt. Once the crisis was confirmed, the logistics of the rescue began. Margaret found a stack of carbon copies of cashier's checks. Arthur never used their joint bank accounts for these transactions. He purchased money orders from dozens of different post offices across the county. He paid exclusively in cash. The return addresses on the envelopes were always vacant lots, abandoned commercial buildings, or post office boxes registered under shell corporations. This was how Arthur maintained absolute, unbreakable anonymity. He created an impenetrable firewall between his quiet suburban existence and his role as a savior. The choice of the pseudonym was highly deliberate. Margaret found a small yellow sticky note attached to a regional map. It bore a single handwritten sentence: "Tom is nobody, so Tom can be everybody." Arthur understood the complex psychology of charity. A wealthy, named benefactor demands gratitude. A known savior creates an uncomfortable power dynamic. A faceless entity named Tom simply provides a reset button. The pseudonym allowed the recipients to keep their dignity intact. They did not owe Arthur a lifelong debt. They only owed the universe a favor. Margaret opened a thick folder marked Medical Urgent. Inside lay the documentation of a complex pediatric surgery. The hospital bill totaled $42,000. Arthur had covered the remaining balance of $11,000. A letter from the family was pinned to the back of the file. They wrote about an anonymous angel. They promised to pay the kindness forward the moment they were back on their feet. Arthur had highlighted that specific sentence with a bright yellow marker. He did not want dependence from these people. He wanted to generate momentum. He funded fresh starts, not ongoing subsidies. The sheer volume of the archive was staggering. Margaret moved to the heavy filing cabinet in the corner of the unit. 4 steel drawers slid open on silent tracks. Hundreds of thick dossiers filled the space tightly. She pulled out random files to grasp the scope. A mechanic in Detroit who needed specialized tools after a devastating workshop robbery. A retired teacher in Seattle facing imminent foreclosure due to predatory lending. A young cellist in Chicago whose antique instrument was destroyed in a basement flood. Arthur had reached across the entire country from this windowless concrete box. He kept physical receipts for every postage stamp, every padded envelope, and every money order fee. The accounting was flawless, balanced to the final cent. Margaret found a separate, smaller lockbox tucked beneath the bottom drawer. Inside rested a heavy, leather-bound ledger. This book answered the most glaring question. It detailed the origin of the funds. Arthur had not drained their retirement accounts. He had quietly invested a small inheritance decades ago. He compounded the interest, day trading during his lunch breaks. Every dollar earned from those trades was funneled directly into the C-17 operation. He turned the cold mechanics of the stock market into a relentless engine for human survival. The ledger showed 0 personal withdrawals. Margaret noticed a distinct pattern in the dates stamped on the files. The interventions spiked sharply during the winter months. Arthur knew exactly when seasonal depression and financial desperation peaked. He anticipated the breaking points of strangers. A massive recycling bin in the corner held the discarded remnants of his research. He subscribed to over 50 local newspapers from across the nation. He spent hours reading the obscure back pages of small-town gazettes. He looked for the tiny, overlooked tragedies that national news ignored. A stolen wheelchair, a burned-down community center, a specialized medical transport van with a blown engine. He spent his Thursday evenings here, surrounded by filing cabinets, quietly balancing the scales of unfair fates. Margaret sat slowly in the high-backed leather chair. The material was worn, shaped by years of her husband's solitary labor. She looked back at the illuminated corkboard. The faces in the photographs smiled back at her through the dim light. Children holding high school diplomas, families standing on the porches of saved homes, small business owners posing in front of repaired storefronts. Arthur was the silent architect of all these pivotal moments. He never sought applause. He never shared the heavy emotional burden or the profound joy of this work with anyone. He carried the weight of hundreds of altered destinies entirely alone. The paper trail proved his unwavering dedication. The meticulous organization proved his deep respect for the process of giving. Margaret realized she was not just looking at a dusty storage archive. She was standing inside a hidden monument to radical empathy. The man she shared a quiet, predictable home with for 30 years was a complete stranger. Looking at the walls of Unit C-17, she understood he was the most extraordinary stranger the world had ever known. The silence of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of saved lives. Margaret pressed the power button on the sleek magnesium chassis. The screen flared to life. It cast a harsh, bluish glow across the polished oak desk. Arthur always kept his digital life at home remarkably dull. His personal tablet contained only crossword puzzles and historical documentaries. This machine was different. It demanded a complex alphanumeric password. She paused, her fingers hovering over the backlit keys. She thought about the corkboard on the wall. She remembered a recurring motif in the pinned thank you notes, the concept of balance. She typed the word equilibrium. The lock screen vanished. A pristine desktop emerged. It lacked the usual clutter of shortcuts and downloaded files. A single, isolated folder sat dead center. Its title read, Second Start. Margaret double-clicked the icon. The window expanded, revealing a meticulously organized directory. The architecture of the folders spanned more than a decade. They were categorized by year, then subdivided by fiscal quarters. This was not a casual hobby. It was a full-scale shadow enterprise. She opened the master index file. A massive spreadsheet materialized. Rows and columns stretched far beyond the edges of the screen. Arthur had engineered a flawless, self-contained accounting ecosystem. He eliminated names entirely to protect privacy. Column A utilized a randomized alphanumeric tagging system. Subject Delta 7. Subject Echo 14. Column B categorized the precise nature of the crisis: foreclosure prevention, emergency transit repair, educational bridging funds. Margaret clicked on a cell in column C. This column tracked the exact financial requirement. The figures were never rounded up or down. They were surgically precise: $842.16, $3,590 exactly. This level of granularity proved a rigorous vetting process. Arthur did not rely on emotional appeals. He demanded invoices, court orders, and official estimates. Another tab at the bottom of the screen caught her attention. It was labeled Verification Protocols. Margaret switched to it. Here, the mechanics of his invisible network became starkly clear. Arthur utilized automated web scrapers and encrypted virtual private networks. He programmed custom algorithms to monitor local community forums, municipal court dockets, and regional crowdfunding platforms. He actively hunted for people slipping through the cracks of the system. He cross-referenced public eviction notices with utility shut-off warnings. He identified individuals facing a temporary, solvable financial cliff. He strictly avoided chronic, systemic issues he could not permanently fix. His strategy was targeted, high-impact intervention. He acted as a financial circuit breaker, stopping a downward spiral before it became irreversible. Margaret opened a subfolder named Disbursements. It contained thousands of digitized bank transfer receipts and wire confirmations. Arthur never handed cash directly to the subjects. He bypassed them entirely to eliminate fraud. He wired funds directly to the creditors. He paid the auto mechanics to release impounded vehicles. He settled the pharmacy bills for critical medications. He cleared the property tax arrears directly with the county clerk. Every transaction originated from a series of blind trusts. The sender was always listed under the corporate shell name, Tom. She returned to the master spreadsheet and scrolled toward the bottom. The sheer volume of data induced a subtle vertigo. The timeline stretched back exactly 14 years. She highlighted the expenditure column for the last 36 months alone. The software instantly calculated the sum in the lower right corner: $485,000. Arthur was a retired structural engineer. He had lived a quiet, frugal life. They drove 10-year-old sedans and took modest domestic vacations. Now, the screen revealed the truth. He had systematically liquidated his private stock portfolio. He had funneled his entire pension and inheritance into this clandestine operation. A strict color-coded system dominated the final columns of the ledger. Green cells indicated a stabilized trajectory. The crisis was averted, and the subject remained solvent. Yellow cells required a mandatory follow-up audit after 90 days. Arthur tracked their credit scores and employment status through public records to ensure the fix held. Red cells marked a systemic failure. The intervention did not hold, and the subject fell back into crisis. The red cells accounted for less than 4% of the total entries. His success rate was staggering. He was operating a highly efficient, private welfare state from a windowless concrete box. Margaret noticed a separate, password-protected text document. The title read, "The Ripple Effect." She bypassed the security with the same password. This file moved beyond raw financial data. It tracked the secondary, unquantifiable impacts of his investments. A single mother whose nursing school tuition he covered had subsequently organized a free weekend health clinic. A local baker saved from bankruptcy had started a daily bread donation program for the nearby shelter. Arthur was mapping a socioeconomic chain reaction. He viewed his money as kinetic energy. He applied it to a specific point of friction to generate forward momentum. He was not merely erasing debt, he was engineering human potential. The digital trace proved the immense scale of his ambition. He wanted to alter the fabric of their city without ever casting a shadow or claiming a single word of gratitude. Margaret closed the spreadsheet. The cooling fan of the laptop hummed softly in the silence. The digital archive answered the mechanical questions. It explained the absolute how and the staggering how much. It detailed the logistics of his perfect, invisible machine. Yet, the cold, illuminated data offered no psychological context. It did not explain the genesis of this massive, secret undertaking. She needed to understand the original catalyst. Her gaze drifted away from the glowing monitor. It settled on the heavy oak desk beneath her hands. The top right drawer was unlocked, left slightly ajar. Margaret ran her fingertips along the underside of the heavy oak desk. The wood felt smooth, polished by years of friction. Near the left corner, her nail caught a shallow groove. She pressed upward with her thumb. A hidden compartment disengaged with a sharp, metallic click. The narrow drawer slid forward smoothly on oiled tracks. Inside lay a single object, a thick, black leather journal. Its edges were frayed. The spine was heavily creased. This was not a ledger of numbers or a file of sterile receipts. This was Arthur's unfiltered voice. She lifted the book. It felt unexpectedly heavy. She opened the cover. The scent of aged paper and dried ink filled the small space. The first entry was dated 14 years ago. It was written on a rainy Tuesday in November. Arthur described sitting in a corner booth at a diner on Elm Street. He had watched a young waitress drop a tray of glasses. She did not clean the mess. She simply sank to the floor and wept. Her name was Clara. Arthur noticed a crumpled eviction notice protruding from her apron pocket. The diary detailed his immediate response. He did not offer her money. He did not speak to her. He memorized the address on the pink slip. He left the diner and drove directly to the property management office. He paid the $3,000 in overdue rent using a cashier's check. He demanded absolute anonymity from the landlord. 3 days later, Arthur parked across the street from Clara's building. He watched her walk up the steps. Her posture had changed. The crushing weight of impending homelessness was gone. She smiled at a neighbor. That afternoon marked the genesis of his secret life. Margaret slowly turned the pages. The journal revealed a meticulously constructed philosophy. Arthur called his method the architecture of the shadow. He firmly believed that traditional, public charity stripped individuals of their dignity. Face-to-face giving demanded a performance of gratitude. It created an insurmountable imbalance of power between the savior and the saved. Arthur wanted to repair the foundation of a life without leaving his fingerprints on the walls. He targeted highly specific, solvable crises. The entries documented his process. He looked for the exact moment where a small financial lever could move a mountain of despair. He wrote about a mechanic named David. David needed a specialized surgery for his daughter. The insurance company denied the claim over a technicality. Arthur bypassed the family entirely. He wired $25,000 directly to the hospital's billing department under the pseudonym Thomas. He included strict legal instructions preventing the hospital from disclosing the source. He also documented the story of a small bakery owner named Elias. Elias was facing bankruptcy due to a predatory loan taken out during a brutal winter. Arthur did not just pay the loan. He hired a proxy lawyer to audit the lending company. This forced the lender to forgive the illegal interest entirely. Arthur then anonymously covered the principal amount. He wrote about watching Elias flip the open sign the morning after the debt was cleared. Arthur noted the exact angle of the morning sun hitting the bakery window. He realized that saving the business did not just save Elias. It saved the 3 employees who relied on those paychecks. It preserved a cornerstone of that neighborhood. Arthur called this the silent ripple effect. Arthur wrote extensively about the mechanics of his anonymity. He maintained rigid operational rules: 0 personal contact, no follow-up communications after the crisis was resolved. He used untraceable funds. He mailed envelopes from different post offices across 3 neighboring counties. The journal also documented his profound internal struggles. He confessed to moments of intense temptation. Sometimes he desperately wanted to step out of the shadows. He wanted to witness the relief in their eyes. He forced himself to remain hidden. He theorized that the mystery itself was a crucial part of the cure. When the recipients received anonymous help, they did not feel indebted to a wealthy stranger. They believed the universe had intervened on their behalf. They felt seen by the world. This belief ignited a fierce, independent drive to recover. It made them resilient. Arthur wrote, "A gift from a stranger is a debt. A gift from the ether is a miracle. Miracles breed strength." Margaret read for hours. The ambient hum of the storage facility faded away. The handwriting on the pages gradually changed. The crisp, forceful strokes of the early years softened. The ink grew lighter. The lines became slightly unsteady. The final entry was dated exactly 2 weeks before his heart stopped. The page was marked with a perfectly pressed maple leaf. The heading was structurally different from the rest. It was not a case study. It was not a philosophical musing. It was a direct address. The top line read, "For Margaret." Her breath caught in her throat. She traced the curves of the letters forming her name. Arthur knew she would eventually find this room. He had engineered this discovery. The letter began with a profound apology. He wrote about the heavy guilt of his deception. He explained why he built a wall between his 2 existences. He needed their home to remain a sanctuary of normalcy. He could not bring the suffocating weight of other people's tragedies into their shared space. He wanted to protect her from the endless, dark tide of human suffering he waded through daily. The tone shifted in the final paragraphs. Arthur confessed his only remaining fear. He was not afraid of his failing health. He was terrified that the chain of interventions would break. He detailed the quiet, solitary joy this hidden life had brought him. He wanted Margaret to understand the profound peace of invisible impact. He wanted her to feel the power of altering a destiny without claiming the glory. The last lines were written with heavy, deliberate pressure. The pen had nearly torn the paper. "I leave you the keys, my love. Not to a dusty storage unit, but to an entirely different way of existing. The active files are organized on the desk. The accounts are fully funded. You know the rules now. You can close this door, walk away, and live your life. I will love you eternally, regardless of your choice. or you can sit in this leather chair. You can pick up the pen. You can become the shadow. The choice is entirely yours." Margaret stared at the final period on the page. The silence in the room felt heavy with expectation. The ghost of her husband was no longer a memory of a quiet, predictable man. He was a titan who had secretly held up the sky for dozens of strangers. She gently closed the leather cover. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany desk. She looked at the blank wall ahead. The grief that had paralyzed her for months began to fracture. A new, strange energy seeped into the cracks. The heavy leather cover of the diary fell shut, sealing away Arthur's final confession. Margaret stood motionless in the center of Unit C-17. The pristine mahogany desk anchored the room, a stark contrast to the corrugated metal walls of the storage facility. The hum of the overhead climate control system was the only sound. Arthur's secret life lay exposed before her. The corkboard, the ledgers, the pseudonym Tom. It was a complete, functioning ecosystem of anonymous philanthropy. Margaret's eyes drifted from the diary to a separate corner of the desk. A wire tray held a single, thick manila folder. Unlike the meticulously archived green binders lining the shelves, this folder was bright red. A yellow adhesive note clung to its cover. Arthur's familiar, sharp handwriting spelled out one word: pending. She reached out and pulled the folder into the pool of light cast by the brass desk lamp. The cardboard was stiff and new. Margaret opened it. The first document was a printed foreclosure notice from a major national bank. The date of execution was set for the 12th of November. That was exactly 9 days away. Clipped to the legal document was a photograph. It showed a woman in her early 30s standing on the porch of a small vinyl-sided house. Two young boys, perhaps 5 and 7 years old, sat on the steps below her. The woman looked directly into the camera. Her posture was rigid, dark circles shadowed her eyes. Margaret recognized that specific physical manifestation of chronic stress. It was the look of someone bracing for an inevitable impact. Below the photograph, Arthur had compiled a comprehensive dossier. He had typed out a timeline of the family's collapse. The woman's name was Clara. Her husband, a local independent contractor, had died in a vehicle collision 8 months prior. He had carried no life insurance. The medical bills from his brief time in the intensive care unit had drained their minor savings account. Clara worked 2 shifts at a regional logistics center. Her income covered basic groceries and utilities. It did not cover the monthly mortgage premium. Arthur had mapped out the exact financial deficit. A printed spreadsheet detailed the arrears, the late fees, and the legal penalties. The total amount required to halt the foreclosure and prepay the mortgage for 6 months was $14,850. Margaret turned the page. Arthur had already initiated the rescue protocol. A cashier's check request form lay half completed. The routing numbers for the hidden philanthropic account were filled in. The payee was listed as the bank's foreclosure department, referencing Clara's loan number. A draft of an anonymous letter, signed by Tom, was paper-clipped to the back. It instructed the bank to apply the funds immediately and send the receipt directly to Clara's address. The preparation was flawless. The execution was incomplete. Arthur's handwriting stopped abruptly at the signature line of the bank authorization form. A silver fountain pen lay parallel to the document, exactly where he must have placed it before his fatal heart attack. The rescue operation had frozen in time the moment his heart stopped beating. Margaret stared at the blank signature line. A cold wave of grief washed over her, different from the sorrow she had felt at his funeral. This was a sharp, functional grief. Arthur had been in the middle of saving a life. His sudden absence was not just a personal tragedy. It was a structural failure for Clara and her 2 children. The bank's machinery was still moving. The 12th of November was approaching regardless of Arthur's death. She stepped back from the desk. The physical weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. Margaret had spent the last 4 months trying to shrink her world. She had canceled subscriptions, emptied closets, and minimized her daily interactions. She wanted to retreat into the quiet safety of her mourning. Taking action here meant doing the exact opposite. It meant expanding her reality to include the suffering of strangers. Her gaze shifted to the corkboard on the left wall. Dozens of thank you letters pinned to the cork represented disasters averted by Arthur's intervention. They were tangible proof of a system that worked, but the red folder on the desk represented a live threat. If Margaret closed the folder and locked the storage unit, the system would permanently die. Clara would lose her home. The boys would be displaced. The eviction was a mathematical certainty. Margaret paced the length of the narrow room. The conflict tore at her logic. She was not a financial strategist. She was a retired high school biology teacher. Operating a shadow charity required deception, meticulous record-keeping, and emotional detachment. She possessed none of those tools. Yet, the entire infrastructure was already built. Arthur had left the engine running. All it required was a new operator to engage the gears. She stopped in front of the desk again. The photograph of Clara seemed to anchor her to the floor. Margaret looked at the exhausted woman's face. She understood the sudden, violent loss of a husband. They shared the same invisible scar. The only difference was that Margaret had a paid-off house and a secure pension. Clara had 9 days until ruin. The silence in the storage unit shifted. It no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a waiting room. Margaret looked at the silver fountain pen. The polished metal reflected the warm light of the lamp. She thought about the empty house, waiting for her across town. She thought about the endless, quiet evening she had spent staring at the television without watching it. Grief had hollowed her out. The red folder offered something to fill the void. Margaret reached across the desk. Her fingers closed around the cold metal barrel of the pen. She pulled the bank authorization form toward her. The paper dragged softly against the leather desk pad. She did not sit in Arthur's chair. She stood tall, leaning over the documents. The decision crystallized in her mind, sharp and irreversible. The mission would not end with Arthur. A heavy brass fountain pen rested on the mahogany desk. It held the power to alter a human trajectory. Margaret picked it up. The cold metal warmed slowly against her skin. Arthur was gone. His shadow, however, remained cast across the open ledger. A single red tab marked the manila folder titled Pending Clara. Margaret looked at the file. The spreadsheet detailed a cascading economic collapse. The fatal vehicle collision had put Clara's husband in the intensive care unit. The resulting medical bills drained the family savings. A missed mortgage payment triggered a late fee. The sheer weight of the impending foreclosure forced a choice between paying the bank and buying groceries. The math of poverty was relentless. It punished a single stroke of bad luck with compound interest. Arthur had mapped this downward spiral with clinical precision. His notes included utility shutoff schedules and local foreclosure statutes. He had calculated the exact sum required to break the cycle and reset their baseline: $14,850. It was not a random act of charity. It was a targeted financial intervention. Margaret turned to the laptop. She opened the encrypted banking portal Arthur had left logged in. The screen displayed the balance of the blind trust. The numbers were staggering. Arthur had quietly amassed a fortune, not for luxury, but for deployment. Margaret verified the available funds. She closed the laptop. She pulled a blank check from the leather binder. Her hand hovered above the textured paper. For 40 years, she had signed her own name to household bills and birthday cards. Now, she prepared to adopt a ghost. She pressed the gold nib to the paper. The black ink flowed in a sharp, deliberate cursive. She did not try to mimic Arthur's rounded, careful script. This was a new chapter. She spelled out the numbers. 14,850. On the signature line, she wrote Tom. This was the alias Arthur had established. Margaret now held the keys to that identity. She folded the check precisely in half. She slid it into a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Arthur's protocol was strict. No return address, no handwritten notes, no explanations that could trigger a sense of obligation. Just a typed label with the recipient's name. She sealed the flap. The adhesive tasted faintly of mint. The heavy steel door of Unit C-17 clicked shut behind her. Margaret stepped out of the climate-controlled facility into the crisp autumn air. She got into her car and drove across town. The landscape shifted from manicured suburbs to a working-class neighborhood built in the 1950s. The houses here were small, paint peeled from wooden siding. Chain-link fences sagged under the weight of overgrown ivy. She parked her car 2 blocks away from the Target address. Margaret walked with measured purpose. A long gray coat blended her silhouette into the gathering twilight. Number 42 was a narrow duplex. A plastic tricycle lay abandoned on the patchy front lawn. The porch steps creaked slightly under her leather boots. She slipped the envelope into the rusted brass mail slot. It landed on the linoleum floor inside with a soft thud. Margaret retreated. She crossed the street and stepped into the deep shadows of a large oak tree. She waited. The streetlights flickered on, casting long pools of yellow light on the cracked asphalt. 15 minutes passed. A battered blue sedan pulled into the driveway. The engine knocked loudly before dying. A woman stepped out. She carried a sleeping child against her shoulder. Her posture radiated exhaustion. The woman fumbled with her keys and unlocked the front door. Margaret watched through the sheer living room curtains. The interior light snapped on. The woman pushed the door shut with her hip. She looked down. She spotted the cream-colored square on the floor. The woman bent down, shifting the child's weight. She picked up the envelope and tore open the seal. She pulled out the check. Margaret saw her freeze. The woman dropped her keys. They clattered unheard against the floorboards. She covered her mouth with a trembling free hand. She sank onto the edge of a worn floral sofa. Tears streamed down her face, catching the harsh overhead light. It was not a cinematic display of joy. It was the visceral, sudden release of crushing pressure. The invisible weight of impending ruin had been lifted in a single second. Margaret turned away. She walked back to her car without looking back. The physical sensation in her own chest had fundamentally changed. The suffocating, stagnant grief of the past 6 months was gone. It was replaced by a sharp, crystalline focus. Her husband had not left her a mess of secrets to clean up. He had bequeathed her a fully operational machine. A mechanism designed to manufacture hope out of raw capital. She drove back to the storage facility. The labyrinth of metal corridors felt different now. It was no longer a tomb holding Arthur's past. It was her headquarters. Room C-17 welcomed her with its warm, focused lamplight. Margaret sat at the desk. The old leather journal, filled to the margins with Arthur's tiny handwriting, lay closed on the corner. Margaret opened the bottom right drawer. She took out a fresh, hardbound notebook. Its pages were blank, bright white, and smelled faintly of binding glue and possibility. She picked up the brass pen once more. She opened the new journal to the very first page. She wrote the current date at the top left corner. Below it, she recorded the evening's event with objective clarity. Clara, $14,850. Delivered. She paused. She considered the image of the woman collapsing onto the sofa. The raw impact of the intervention required acknowledgement. Margaret added a new column to Arthur's established format. She titled it, Outcome. Underneath, she wrote, Trajectory corrected. Ruin averted. Margaret closed the book. The silence of the underground room was no longer empty or oppressive. It hummed with kinetic potential. She looked up at the corkboard on the wall. Dozens of blank spaces waited between the pinned receipts and old thank you notes. They were waiting for new stories. Margaret was no longer a widow, mourning a quiet, predictable man. The illusion of her past life had shattered, revealing a profound hidden architecture. She was the new author of the ledger, the guardian of the shadow fund. She turned on the laptop, opened the next red-tabbed file, and began to read. Margaret's story proves that sometimes the people we think we know perfectly are hiding the most beautiful secrets of all. It reminds us that true impact doesn't need an audience, and real heroes often operate in the shadows. If this incredible story touched your heart today, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales about hidden truths and second chances. We would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments below. What would you have done if you unlocked Arthur's secret storage unit? Thank you so much for watching. And remember, kindness works best when nobody is watching. We'll see you in the next video.